Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation. Thank you all very much for your patience. We have qualmed the rest of those last-minute gremlins that we always seem to get. Yeah, welcome to Thursday, 2nd of June. We're a little bit later than we normally do. Normally, we would have been doing this last week, but the Powerhouse had their event on last week, and we didn't want to clash with that. Yeah, I don't know if anyone made it down to the Powerhouse event, but it was pretty good. I think the gaming one was a record turnout for them, so chances are they'll probably do some more gaming ones in the future. Fingers crossed. If they do and you see that come up, I'll share it through the Wargaming socials as well if it does happen. Make sure to get yourself along to it. It was a really, really good evening. Lots of interesting talks, one of which was from one of my colleagues at WG Sydney. But that is not what you're here for tonight. Yes, we're here tonight to hear from Dr. Benjamin Abraham, who's been doing some research into just how climate friendly is game development. So not, what do you put into your game, but how do you make your game and how do you make sure that that game is not destroying our planet? So without further ado, I think it's good if we get on to Ben and let him tell us himself what it is that we can do and what it is that we should be maybe changing in our development processes. So Ben, over to you. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for having me, senior game developers. I've known you've been meeting for a while. I've heard about a few other events, but I've never been to one myself. So I'm glad to get the opportunity to get along to kind of present. So my name is Dr. Benjamin Abraham, and I'm going to talk to you about what do we do about the game industry's carbon footprint, basically. And as a little kind of overview of, before I begin, I guess this is the kind of same-ish talk, maybe bit of light editorializing as we go through to kind of switch it up a bit, that I gave in March in San Francisco at the Game Developers Conference. And I guess the three main points, the three key things that I want to hit on today are, I want to talk about what makes a game truly green. I think we have a lot of ideas about what that might look like. I think we've maybe got the messaging a little bit wrong in the past in the industry about what is a green game, and I think it's actually really simple. It's a very simple thing to answer, but a very hard thing to achieve, of course. And then I'm going to talk about how we do that. How do we make games green? How do you make your game green? How anyone can, basically. And then a few of the other kind of longer term goals that we might want to achieve as well, to do with like sustainability and things like that. So yeah, a little bit about me. I am primarily a researcher. I was an academic for about 10 years. I was teaching at UTS up until 2020, when I left to kind of go finish this research and kind of move into a different field. Yeah, so I started this work at the end of my PhD in 2015, start of 2016. I was looking around and kind of asking myself, what was the next thing? What was the next thing that I wanted to actually do? What do I want to work on? And the only thing I really could figure I wanted to do or really cared about was something to do with games, because I love games. I've always been involved in games, and something about climate change, because I was, for years, like probably many of us, have been reading, all the warnings and the IPCC reports and all the news, and just going like, I got to do something. So back then I started writing this book. I started the research back then, and it took me a long time. And along the way, I talked to game developers like Wargaming's Simon Hayes. I talked to him about what you're already doing, and I talked to some other indie developers, and I read a bunch of reports. I did a big survey in the start of 2020 asking for game developers to tell me, like, do you know what your carbon emissions are? Do you know how much power you're using? Do you have plans in place? Like, what's kind of going on? Because there wasn't a whole lot of momentum around this yet at the time. And then I started to find these things called CSR reports, which are corporate social responsibility reports that big companies put out. And this is a kind of trend in large multinational companies, and they're basically their social license to operate, basically to look like reasonable and ethical corporate citizens. They put out these reports about how they're actually doing that. And that has a lot of information in it. And a lot of the time it has their energy consumption and emissions now as well. And I also looked at the energy consumption of gaming devices, a couple of the ones that I have a hold of, and then I found some studies, some research on others. And I did what's called an ICP-MS test, or an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry test, on a PS4 APU, which is the main CPU GPU chip of the PS4 console. And basically what that does is they take a tiny little sample of it, they sort of guillotine out like a tiny little, like 1 gram of the actual chip, they dissolve it in super concentrated acid, and then they blast it with a stream of plasma, which then ionizes it all, and they can kind of tell me what are the elementary components in the chip. So it told me a list of all of the metals, all of the precious metals, the common metals, the ones you've probably never heard of before, and like, yeah, and the ones that are in the PS4. And then I went and looked, and I was like, okay, well, where do those metals come from in the world? And what does it take to refine them, to dig them up out of the ground, to get them into this format that, you know, appears to us as a PS4 on a shelf in a shop? And so doing all of that work and writing it all up, I basically argue that there's a really urgent need for the game industry to go carbon neutral. And I think probably if you're here, chances are good that you have some kind of inclination towards that as well. And the question now is like, okay, well, what does that look like, and how do we actually achieve it? So some baseline numbers that I came up with, because one of the other exercises that I was trying to do, or one of the other goals of the research, was to find out what the current emissions are like, what sort of scale of those emissions. And I came up with these figures. Some of them are from other researchers. And yeah, so basically game development, the activity of making games, sitting in an office, making 3D assets, programming, producing, scheduling, all of that kind of stuff, all of that activity all around the world, with the number of game developers that we think there is. There's no central figure. That was one of the chief challenges, is like estimating just how many game developers there were. Using the data that I gathered from the survey and then some of the other reports and stuff, I put a figure of 3 to 15 million tons in that kind of sphere of game production activity. So 3 to 15 million tons of CO2 every year. And obviously, as the industry gets bigger, that ends up growing, unless we do something about it. I also looked at distribution and how much energy, how much carbon is emitted getting discs to players or downloading them as well. And there's a really great study that I refer to all the time by a guy from the UK. His name's Joshua Aslan, and he did this really, really detailed study of like, what's the best method of getting games into players' hands or playing games. And it's really, really complicated. And a study in 2014, or it was published in 2014 using 2010 data, found that 415,000 tons of CO2 were emitted just getting discs from the factory in Austria to the UK. And my own figure, I did some back of the envelope sums, and I looked at how many discs were coming to Australia roughly in a year, and how far they have to go and how they might get here. And I was like, well, it's probably 800 tons per year just getting discs to Australia. And you can imagine, like, other parts of the world, it all comes down to like how far they are from the factory that makes them. And other parts of the world obviously have, similar sorts of emissions to that. And then there's the question of how much is emitted when players play our games, when they switch on their consoles, when they have their TVs on, or even when they're playing on a phone. That's energy that's got to come from somewhere. And again, Joshua Aslan here put a figure of 6.7 million tons of CO2 on the entire lifetime of PS4s just in Europe, only up to about 2020. So like 2013 to 2020, 7 years of PS4s. It's like 1 million tons a year, basically. And another study by Mills and a bunch of other people in the US put a figure of about 24 million tons on all gaming devices. So that's PCs, consoles, I guess smartphones and tablets and things like that in the US, and that's per year. And then lastly, the kind of granddaddy of all these figures is actually making things. Actually making stuff is always like really energy intense. And again, Aslan here, he worked with Sony to kind of arrive at these figures, and he put a figure of about 5.8 billion tons of CO2 on the manufacturing of PS4s up to 2020 again. So these are big numbers. They're quite sobering, I think, and it really just kind of shows us, like, yeah, we often, it's easy, I think, to kind of get lost in or lose sense of the end gamer at the end of the day, and like, you know, the scale of our games. Yeah, I think it's a real challenge, and seeing the CO2 numbers there, I think, reminds us of just how big of a challenge it is. So there's a couple of things that I'm not talking about tonight. And the number one is I'm not going to talk about what kind of games you should make, or even what games you should avoid. It's not really what it's about. To me, that's not really an issue. I think you can make, and I think this is a real strength of the kind of situation that we're in, is you can make kind of any kind of game you want and do it in a carbon neutral way. It's not even about putting climate content into your game. It's about what we do to address these carbon emissions, you know, the very real concrete problem. And that's the essence of climate justice, really, is like taking it seriously and doing what we actually need to do to address it. So as a little pithy aside, just like how we know now, I think, that tweets are not how we solve racism, games, I think, are not how we solve climate change. It's not about making games to kind of convince people to do things differently. It's about taking our kind of responsibility, or taking responsibility for our area and doing something about it. It would look really great to make the game that solves climate change, but I just don't think it's going to happen. It's not really possible. We solve climate change by stopping the use of fossil fuels. So that's coal mining, and that's natural gas, that's fracking, it's like oil, you know, all these like nasty things that actually have these really terrible side effects that we don't really want anyway. Yeah, we change climate change, or we solve climate change by preventing all these things. So my argument then is that green games, a truly green game, is one that is fossil fuel free. It's got very little to do with what the game's about, whether it's got green themes in it, whether it's trying to convince people to change their behaviors or not. I just don't think that's relevant to this question. I don't think it is the main problem. And I think it's completely understandable as game designers, game developers, you know, whatever your specialty is, to want to use those skills you have to help. But unfortunately, those are not the things that we need to achieve this goal, right? We need other things done. So in some respects, I think this actually should be a big relief to some people. And like, again, I think this is a strength of this kind of approach, is that you can make whatever games you want and you can make it sustainably. If there's no fossil fuels in it, go nuts. If you're all renewable, if your game making process doesn't touch a single drop of a fossil fuel, then like, go nuts. Do whatever you want. It's a little bit facetious, but you could make like the next Call of Duty, and if you make it without any fossil fuels in it, it's a green game. You could make Bone Crusher 9000, like School Shooter 2020 or something. You know, it's an extreme example, but if it's sustainable, it's like, yeah, if it's not using fossil fuels, it's sustainable. That's what I'm saying. So how do we do that? How do we get rid of fossil fuels? Well, a little bit of a kind of side diversion into how we count our emissions. Basically, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a set of emissions counting standards that basically the World Business Council has kind of come up with, and most people accept. And it's a good way to kind of categorize where your emissions are and kind of measure them, and then get a sense of like, okay, how do we respond to that and do something about it? So Scope 1 emissions are any fossil fuels that you burn yourself. So that's gas in maybe like a central heating system or a boiler. It's any cars that you run. If you have like a petrol generator or a diesel generator or something, yeah, any kind of fossil fuels that you buy yourself and burn to produce power or heat or whatever, those are Scope 1 emissions. And typically, most game developers are not going to have that many. You're not going to have much in Scope 1, especially unless you're quite a large company. Scope 2 emissions are where most of the activity happens. That's where someone else is burning a fossil fuel on your behalf to make you power. So that's in a power station. Maybe it's coal-powered or gas-powered. And yeah, it happens somewhere else, but basically they are doing it for you. Anytime you're plugged into the Australian power grid, as we are here, a certain amount of that power, just unavoidably, because of the nature of the network, comes from fossil fuels. And that's a real challenge. And then Scope 3 is this kind of optional category or semi-optional. It's should be included, but there's some technicalities around it. It can be easy to like double count the emissions, and you just sort of want to avoid that a bit. But anytime someone else burns fossil fuels on your behalf because of a product or a service that you've sold to them, or in the process of providing you with a product or service. So that's whenever you fly on a plane. So maybe Jetstar is burning the jet fuel there for you. Whenever you ride in a taxi, another car, someone else is burning fossil fuels for you. And for game developers, it's players at the end of the day who are at home, sitting behind a power meter, just sitting somewhere here like my house, and plugged into their wall socket and using power, because we know most of the world's power is still not generated renewably. Although I'm quietly optimistic about that turning around. So how do we measure some of these things? Well, Scope 1 emissions, yeah. Do you burn fossil fuels on site? Think about these things like natural gas, vehicles, generator. Find out the quantity of however much you used. And typically, if you are using fossil fuels, you'll probably know because they're fucking expensive. Unlike renewables, where it just falls out of the sky and we just get to use it for free, fossil fuels have to be dug up, and they cost a lot of money. So find out how much of it you've used, whether it's like a volume, quantity, or if it's like a car, sometimes you can use a vehicle-based, distance-based calculator. And then what you do is you grab the quantity and you grab what's called an emissions factor for that particular type of fuel. It basically says this much of CO2 is in a certain amount of fuel, and then you multiply the emissions factor by the amount consumed. And that tells you how much Scope 1 emissions, how much you've emitted. And the solutions, really, there's no solution to fossil fuel emissions other than replacing them. And actually, we've got the technology to do this basically in every area already. So you swap out your gas central heating with heat pumps, the old good old-fashioned reverse cycle air conditioner. You swap to public transport and electric vehicles, and you maybe get a battery-based backup instead of a generator. Scope 2 emissions, again, have a similar process. Excuse me. You get the amount you've consumed, but this time it's power. So you basically, if you're paying for electricity, you will get a power bill in most cases, and that power bill almost always has to tell you how much you've consumed, because that's how much they're charging you for. So you get that figure in kilowatt hours, you find the emissions factor for your region. So in New South Wales, you can Google and find a couple of different websites that tell you the emissions factor. And then you, again, just multiply those numbers together, the kilowatt hours figure with your emissions factor, and that tells you this many kilograms or tons of CO2 that have been emitted for that amount of electricity. Well, that's a little bit of a simplified way of doing it, but getting it any more kind of detailed than that starts to get really complicated. You need to look at things like time of use, the time that you're using it. At the moment, like in the Australian electricity network, if you're using power between, say, 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock, a little bit wider time, during summer, then basically you're probably going to be running mostly off of renewables because we have so much solar, so much sun. But yeah, it's really hard to kind of incorporate those like live figures into our data. So mostly we just stick with these emissions factors. It sort of averages out over time, particularly if you do it over a long enough time. So the solution, again, here is ways to reduce your consumption, right? And if you have the option, as we do in Australia, to shop around power providers, you can find one that will offer 100% renewable options. I think there's like at least 2 or 3 that are doing that. And that can be a little bit expensive. If you don't want to do that, you can find a 100% offset one instead. And that's still better than nothing. Not a huge fan of offsets, but it's sort of a bit inevitable at the moment, especially for power in the Australian grid. And then lastly, scope 3 emissions for the games industry. It's a little bit more complicated, involves a few more factors, but again, it's all relatively achievable. And this is the sort of thing you could build into your upcoming games or your existing games. So what you want to do there is you want to collect duration of play figures for your users. So you want to know how long they've been playing for, as well as what device they've been playing on, and then where they are in the world. And if you've got all those 3 things, then you can just, kind of multiply them together. So you get the duration in hours, times that by the device power consumption. Again, we're sort of estimating here because it does fluctuate a little bit, but not hugely. And then all you do is you divide that by 1,000 and you get like kilowatt hours, usually because the device itself is in watts. Again, it's a little bit of like maths involved, but it's doable to figure out. And then you multiply it in the kilowatt hour figure with the local emissions factor, and that will tell you, okay, this many players, our 100,000 players or whatever, who played for 1,000 hours on a PS4 that was using 150 watts, 200 watts, and an emissions factor of XYZ, and then you come up with a certain amount of tons for CO2 that those players have likely emitted. So the solution here for the lower power devices, things like phones, which use maybe single watts or up to maybe 8 watts, I think is the most powerful phone that I've seen. What you can then do is like you can pay a little bit of money to a reliable, reputable, certified offsetting company, and basically in exchange for that, they'll plant some trees or they'll do something else to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere by that same amount. And for console games, for PC gaming, unfortunately, what my research has shown is that it tends to get a bit too expensive, right? So just because a console uses maybe 100 times more power than a phone, these are not huge amounts of power like on their own, but they add up with the size of the audiences that we're often dealing with in games. When you have 1 million players and they're all using 200 watts, that's like, I don't know, 2,000 kilowatts probably an hour or something. That's a lot. That's a lot of power distributed across a lot of people, and us paying for their emissions, game developers paying for their emissions, is probably not a viable approach. I also don't recommend that we spend a lot of time and effort trying to make our software use less energy, at least not as like a top priority, because there are other things that are more important. And I just can imagine us spending lots and lots of time and effort on that. You make your, like, I don't know, maybe you save 20, 30% of your, overheads in terms of energy. And then you're like, great. And then some other artist on your team goes, excellent. All right. So I can do 20 to 30% more pixels on screen, or I can push more, whatever, so it's hardware, I think, that really sets the limits there. And additionally, like, once we get to 100% renewables, like, who gives a crap whatever our players are doing? If they're all on renewables, like, go nuts. It doesn't matter. But that's maybe like 10, 15, 20 years away. So for the immediate short term, the next couple of years, which we keep hearing is a crucial time, we're going to have to find something to kind of do to reduce these numbers. So if you're at all kind of a greenie or climate minded or whatever, this might not be new to you, but renewable power grids are basically like the silver bullet. They're the closest thing we have to like a fix-all solution. 100% renewable power changes everything, like, over the long term. And like at that point, the calculus stops being how do we use less power? It's more like, it's very, very different sorts of questions that start to occupy us, but we're not there yet. And so in the interim, we need a lot that we can do to contribute. And here's just a little slide that I've added in recently because I think it's an incredible incredible little projection of the cost of renewable power. It's this talk. If you want, I'll put the link in the chat later on. But basically, the actual costs of solar and solar modules and installing, new solar panels and big solar, grid scale solar have beaten every single projection that the International Energy Agency has ever made. Basically, the numbers, it just keeps getting cheaper and cheaper. Solar panels are just like fucking bee's knees. And the price of them is very, very quickly like making every other kind of mode of energy generation like obsolete with enough like battery backup and stuff. So it's really cool talk too if you're interested in it. So some other things that I wanted to point to in kind of this last little bit of the talk, this is sort of like the last third, is what we can kind of do that might help develop or might, I guess what I'm presenting here, or I'm talking about here, is some research that comes out of a completely different field. It's from the fast-moving consumer goods field, which is all about like consumer goods, snack foods, soft drinks, treats, coffee, things like that, which has done there's been a lot of research around what consumers think in terms of sustainability and how that affects their purchasing decisions. Because I think some of that has relevance for the games industry, and I suspect there are things that we can do to kind of push that forward. And this is the sort of thing that we might be able to do to kind of shift things a little bit further. So this is a slide from the Accenture Future of Work study. And they, just highlighting here the attitudes of consumers. 74% of the consumers they talk to believe that ethical corporate practices and values are an important reason to choose a brand. That's pretty huge. Like that's not just a majority, that's an overwhelming majority. And from an economic perspective too, sustainable indices outperformed the other kinds of investments. So sustainable companies are just doing better across the board. And that's, I think, something to think about, something to consider. Again, some more research here from Greenprint. This is called the Business of Sustainability Index. Their study found that 75% of millennials were willing to pay more for a product that's environmentally sustainable. And they were just like the standout one. The other generations were, not far off either. So like this is something that's people say they're interested in and willing to put a premium on. I think it's interesting that Gen Z is kind of back down lower, but that makes sense to me because I just think they don't have any money yet. So yeah, I suspect the Gen Z numbers will come up too. But, and that might be something we can think about in games. Like, all right, what can we do there? What can we do with that? Nielsen, a little bit of research here from Nielsen, the big market research company, found that a whopping 81% of global respondents felt strongly that companies should help improve the environment. And that's not just like limited to, I don't know, millennials and Gen Z. That's like everyone. Everyone thinks that it's all our responsibility to be responsible environmental stewards. I think that applies in games too. And then the last one, I think it's the last one, is this bit of research from Mintel. And this was the one that was kind of most interesting to me because it had some really important takeaways that I think are actually quite applicable to games. So one of their takeaways was that sustainability-minded consumers are just like everyone else. And so what they took that to mean is like, or what the research suggests that means is that, yes, customers who are interested in sustainability still need like the quality of your product to be good. Like it's not like you can't release like garbage and be like, oh, it's sustainable garbage. It's not how it works. Basically, the way that I interpret this for games is that making your game green or marketing it as a green game, obviously being truthful in your marketing, might not make you sales. But what I suspect is that as we kind of progress and as the climate crisis intensifies and people get more and more serious about action and demanding action from the people that they're buying from, not being green might lose the sales eventually. And that's something to, I think, just keep in the back of your head, because I think that's really, really important. Yeah, so what I see here in this space is the potential, I guess, for some audience development. I think there's potentially a market or a very small segment or slice of the market that might be willing to pay a premium, for instance, or gravitate towards carbon neutral games. And I see this because, I mean, we already know as gamers ourselves and as people who, move in circles with lots of other gamers, that they often have a social conscience, right? Just like how diversity issues and equity and the importance of representation in games and media has become a really key thing in games over the last, 10 years or so. Again, climate is another social justice issue, and that's going to become, I think, more and more of a more and more to the front. And what form that looks like, I don't know. I think we need to be prepared for what it will look like, because it could be, as much as it could look like the pushback against NFTs, which has been, a lot of the critique of it has been its kind of carbon footprint, particularly of the Ethereum chain and its, the proof of work systems and things like that. Yeah, so I think that's, there's evidence of there being potential there. And I think also too, little green activations and green themed games, I think they're just not going to cut it. I think gamers are pretty savvy, right? They're not willing to be they're not going to fall for, just little kind of fiddly things around the side. So I think there's potential to make green games as a unique selling point. And I'm interested in finding out who's going to be the first to market and sell the first truly green game. And I know by doing this research, I found a couple of studios that have been doing this. Basically, there's at least one in London that does a really good job already of neutralizing their emissions, and they want to go even further than that. They want to take emissions out of the atmosphere. And I know Wargaming as well. I talked to Simon and made great progress as well there. And I think we could make a bigger deal of that. It need to be done in a sensible way, but I think there's potential. And I think particularly indie game makers are maybe in the best spot to take advantage of this. They tend to be kind of closer to their audience. Maybe you know them more intimately, and maybe able to communicate to them more individually in a way, and find those markets, find those audiences. So as well, and this is just as a little aside, but if anyone's going to make a persuasive climate change game, it's not going to be like a mass market game. It's not going to be a game for everyone. It's going to be really, really precise for a very particular kind of audience that maybe needs a specific sort of intervention, either in how they, I don't know. I go into a little bit more detail in my book, but I think that's, I think we end up barking up the wrong tree a bit if we spend a lot of time on that sort of thing. So longer term, I guess in the next, again, looking ahead to more and more years ahead, there are other things that we can start to do as game developers and designers to support kind of sustainable goals. So another one is to try and show or surface to players their own energy and emissions. And we, as players, we don't really know these things, Until I started doing this research, I didn't really have a good sense of the energy consumption of my games console or my TV. I had a sense that like, oh yeah, is it a bit? Probably not too much, but it's probably not nothing either. So doing things like showing it to them, just being like, hey, you played for this many hours, probably it used this much energy, which means it meant probably this much emissions, and showing that to players can be quite transformative. And I know this experience because when I got solar put on my roof, we got a device that plugged into the switchboard, and it tells me like live how much energy I'm using. And being able to see the numbers and see like, when I switch on a device and the number goes up a bit, or when I switch things off and it goes down, like it's quite important to have that feedback. We don't really have that at the moment. The other thing we can do, and this is like really easy actually, is sell games only digitally. That's the only real substitute we have for sending discs all around the world, which has a carbon footprint attached. There's a price tag. And all those discs, they're all going to end up in landfill eventually. They're not easy to recycle, especially like polycarbonate. That plastic is not a great candidate for putting in your recycle bin because it's got all these other stuff in it. It's got like that foil and things like that. Avoiding business flights whenever we can, doing things remotely. Extending support to older hardware helps drag out that hardware generations. Extending further helps prevent embedded emissions in new devices. Again, this is sort of hard to do as like an individual studio or a company, but maybe as a whole industry, we could get together and reach some kind of consensus around what we could do in this space. And opting out of the hardware upgrade cycle. Again, it's the same for the same reason that new devices are incredibly energy intense. The same thing I think happens around computationally intense graphics. If we can shift even a little bit of a focus over to like style and aesthetics instead of this constant like photorealism thing, then we could maybe slow that down a little bit. And to give you a sense of like what the balance is between power and embedded emissions in the device itself, Apple reckons about 50% of iPhone emissions come from manufacturing. I think that's maybe it shifts a little bit for consoles and computers, but not too far off. Sorry, my dogs are going off. So a couple of things to look up later on if you're interested in the greenhouse gas protocol itself. There's there's the greenhouse gas protocol itself with some ICT specific guidance for computer industries. There's something called the GRI standards, which is like a reporting scheme for emissions and companies. There's a sustainability registry called EPEAT, which doesn't have a whole lot in it, but I think is hopefully going to be filled out as companies start to submit their devices. yeah, a whole bunch of other stuff. And at my website, I've collected some of these resources as well to check out later on. So yeah, that's pretty much it. The main themes or the main kind of points are that a green game is a carbon neutral game, and I think anything else does a disservice both to us, to the planet, and to our players. I think we're deluding ourselves if we don't emphasize and get this point right. We need to get rid of carbon, get rid of fossil fuels. And we make it green by addressing the three scopes that I kind of laid out. And we start that just by figuring out how much we're using to begin with, and then figuring out alternatives. And I'm also really excited about the potential that we might have for, reaching more players or identifying those players who are willing to kind of help us in this process and come along with us and, do it together, a market for green games. I think that's potential there. So yeah, thanks for listening, and look forward to any questions you might have.
Okay, everyone, as you just heard, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat now. Ben, can I get you to go full screen on your face so that we can see you?
Yeah, I'm gonna just show my bibliography too. Here's my list for the sake of anyone who's wanted to have a look. All right, we're there. Am I back?
You are back. Okay, so let's see about questions. So while we're waiting just to see what questions come through, one that we sort of had a chat about earlier is, companies doing all these things, is great. But at the moment, because of the situation that we have, everyone's working from home. I myself, I'm home usually 2 to 3 days, so 3 or 4 days per week. So, all the great things that Simon, as you mentioned, have done in the wargaming office, I'm not really taking the benefit from, because I'm here, I've got my aircon on to keep the place cold or hot, whatever it is. And I'm not using the wonderful recycled electricity. So, what do you think about that? What can we do?
Yeah, so it's a challenge, and I think it's like, as you say, it's not just a challenge for teams that maybe permanently work from home. It's a challenge for like everyone. So one of the things that I've been doing recently is I've been working with a studio based in Melbourne called Paper House. They made the wonderful little game Paperbark on iOS a few years ago with the wombat. Yeah, beautiful game. I've been working with Terry, who's the kind of studio head down there, to figure out some ways we might, I guess, estimate how much they're using in their kind of work from home. And also, like, I kind of wasn't happy with estimates, because you can do estimates. You can say like, all right, I was using my PC for this many hours. I know that my PC uses maybe this much power roughly, and then go like, man, I've probably used this much. But a really like accurate number is quite hard to arrive at. So one of the things I've done is I found a really cheap little kind of plug-in wall socket device you can get, and you can plug your PC or your devices into that, and it will just kind of log the data for you. One of the things I'd like to do is to be able to make a little program that anyone could kind of use. You just buy the plug, stick it in, set it up, and then you set up the app, and then it collects the data for you. And then you can calculate your emissions that way. So yeah, direct measuring of devices is really useful, even as like a kind of way to establish a baseline as well. So you could just like, have a little power meter. They're really quite cheap to get if you just know where to go. Go to JCar or something, plug in your computer to it, and then, measure it for a day, and then see like, okay, if this is an average day, I'm using this much power, times that by the days at your home, and then you'll know your figure.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions coming in, so I'll start reading those out. So from Bilal, he's the first one to get a question in. Scope 2 emissions measurement doesn't seem to consider whether a renewable power provider is used or not. Is that correct?
So it should. And it's tricky because the way, and this is where it gets into the kind of more complicated details about how different countries, different regions, power supplies work, right? So if you're in California, for instance, you don't have an option of where you buy your power from. You just buy from one utility, the Californian Power and Water Company, and that's it. Like that's the one provider, and they're quite lucky there in that the state has been investing in renewables for, I don't know, like a couple decades now. And so they just had the other day, they had a new record where they hit about 98% renewables in the state. So the whole state basically for a couple of hours was powered by renewables. And this is why it kind of gets a bit tricky when you just use like a kind of consumption number, because you might have used those 10 kilowatts, but if you use them during the middle of the day when the sun's really shining, there is no emissions really. But if you use them 10 kilowatts at night when the sun's not shining, when the wind's not blowing, and you don't have a contract with 100% renewable power provider, then you don't get that benefit. In Australia, we have a thing called a national energy market, which also complicates things. It's actually the biggest engineered machine in the world because it spans all the way from Queensland, all the way down to Victoria, all the way across to South Australia. And then there's, I think, an interlink to Tasmania. And it's one electrical network. And it's got like bottlenecks and all sorts of problems depending on where you are. But basically when we buy from a power from a retailer, we are buying from whatever the network is kind of giving us as well. So we don't even have the option really to choose, I only want power from solar panels to come to my house, and I want it to switch off at those other times. Like we don't get to do that because the network is just like moving electricity around all the time, and it's just doing its thing. So yeah, like it's really complicated. And what most companies do is you'll buy from them, and then they will guarantee they offset 100% of your emissions. So you put the onus on them, your power company, to go like, all right, we provided this much power at these times of the day, and we paid the offset cost for it.
Yeah.
So that's sort of what usually tends to happen in Australia.
Okay.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's so complicated.
Yeah, it sounds it. The next question we have is from Luke, and that is, what would be the first thing you would do as an indie or small business that could be implemented in, say, a week or a month?
Good question. I mean, I guess in Australia, we have the option to shop around for our power. And the first thing that I would do is, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. My dog just ran in chasing the cat.
Oh, no.
Gizmo, out. Oh dear, I should have closed my door.
Hopefully the cat's okay.
Oh yeah, she's fine. She gives as good as she gets. The first thing I would do is I would shop around for at least offset power. So your power was coming from someone who was willing to pay, the offset costs for that. And if you're willing to go whole hog, try and find someone who's going to provide 100% renewable. So you might need to pay a little premium. Again, this gets into the mechanisms of how the Australian energy market works, and I have a rough sense of how it works, but like you don't want to have to get involved in that. That is like insane. Power engineers and like economists and markets and stuff. It's like it sucks. It just sucks.
It sounds it. Simon is actually in the chat, and he commented that his consoles use solar power only, so there's nothing to offset. A question.
If you're playing during the day, I've got solar panels on my roof too, and again during the day, it's like that mostly provides most of our power.
Yeah, that's definitely a good option. Nico King asks, games focused on green topics might not save the world on their own, but do you think that games that are focused on green topics and are carbon neutral have potential? He then goes on to say, I feel like it's a topic that people care about, So a
Mm.
somewhat untapped market for mass market games, at least.
Yeah. So I go into a bit more detail in the book, Nico, about about what the kind of latest research about, like, games' ability to persuade people says. And I guess my kind of take on it is that a lot of the approaches haven't accounted for enough the actual player themselves at the end of the day, and the complexity that's involved in just any kind of media reception, right? Like, so if you think about it, like, if you're when you as a creator are trying to communicate a message to someone, um, if you, maybe a good analogy is like speaking the language that they know, right? Like,
Hmm.
if you're making a game and you're making it, you're making it for, like, I don't know, the Japanese market or the Chinese market, right? You got to speak in the language that they actually use. And I see a lot of interest in making games that, like making green games, I suppose, games that, like, maybe educate, um, that maybe what it needs to do is, like, understand who the player is, what their particular kind of what their, like, media life world is like. There's a really good book by Katie Salen, I think, was the editor, and I forget, there's a co-editor too. But it's basically all these, like, research into, like, what is the place and the role of games in the lives of young people and, like, children, and all that research was really, really fascinating. And a big part of it is, like, so much of the meaning that these young people take from games is actually informed by whatever their wider circumstances are. So it comes back to, like, okay, well, how are they engaging with this game with their friends? How are they talking about it with their friends? What's their family think about it? Do they play with their parents? Do they play on their own? How do their parents react to media? Um, and so I think I think there's potential. We can do lots of things, but it's being aware of what the barriers are, I think, and being, like, really smart and clever about identifying the audience that we're trying to reach, what kind of an outcome we're hoping to have, and being open to the possibility of failure. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
yeah, go make your games. I'm definitely not saying don't make climate games. I just think that, as a priority, our first priority needs to be, decarbonization. And then after that, like, yeah, do whatever you want. I don't, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me. Yeah.
Okay. Bilal just follows up with, you mentioned the potential of whole game industry movements.
Mm.
Are there any of these going on that you're aware of that we can find and get behind?
Yeah. So there's a couple of directions. So number one is the Playing for the Planet Alliance, which is a UN program. And yeah, if your studio wants to be involved with that, just reach out to them. I'm not sure exactly what's involved in kind of becoming, excuse me, part of that, but um, they are collecting kind of the most kind of, like, climate focused game studios and publishers and companies, and yeah, kind of working together. And I think they have, like, a monthly call where they sort of share progress and things like that. So
Hmm.
yeah, look at them. They put out some resources. Um, There's also the IGDA, the International Game Developers Association. They have a climate special interest group, which is a kind of volunteer-driven group. You can get involved in that. And again, that's, like, voluntary. They produce a lot of useful resources, though. They have a really great. They have just released a really good guide to um, like, making climate type games, climate
Yeah.
focused games. And one of the things that I think is a strength of that document is that they start with very, very particular, like, theoretical focus. Like, here is the theories of change that these are the peer reviewed ideas about how people change ideas or change their minds, or all this kind of stuff. Really, really useful. And then there's also like the hardware side of things, which I think is a really, really big part of the question. And I'm trying to get along to this European Union initiative, which is this sort of self-regulation meeting thing that they have every few months, which has got the three main kind of console manufacturers, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo.
Okay.
And they all go along and they're like, all right, these are the things that we can agree on to do with energy efficiency. And yeah, I'm trying to get there to go and ask some questions and be like, hey, here's the research I've done. It's pointing to these things. Can we do something in this particular direction? And yeah, I'm not having a whole lot of luck in getting there, but yeah, I don't know, fingers crossed. I'm cautiously optimistic that I think that could be a really good avenue, because that if we can get the whole kind of hardware side of things to agree to some, I don't know, some sensible limits. That's like the frame that I'm thinking at the moment.
Yeah.
Nothing to like, I don't know, like say, oh, we can't make any new games or whatever. Nothing like ridiculous like that, but just things that don't necessarily have to challenge the bottom line of the games industry, don't have to stifle innovation, but can have real kind of climate impacts positively.
Yeah.
Those are the things that I'm interested in.
Oh, that sounds great. Hopefully you'll be able to get along to that. We've got another question from Nico. So in terms of the broader issue of climate change and carbon emissions, what do you think that the major obstacles are for us reaching more ambitious goals? Is it just financial or political, or is it just apathy?
Oh man, what a question.
Nico's coming in with the good questions tonight.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, isn't it? I guess I come back to this idea of 100% renewable power, because as soon as we get to that, just so many problems just disappear, and all of the kind of like really like switched on smart climate people, their emphasis is on electrification as a process that ends up kind of just automatically reducing emissions, because electric vehicles, electric heating, particularly like heat pump heating, it's just so much more efficient as well. So there are all sorts of things that we need to do. We know how to do them. We have the money to do them. They're not even that expensive. Like a lot of the economics of renewables is like totally solved. It's totally within budget. It's mostly, I think, just being political will, and I guess the forces arrayed against us, which we need to be kind of realistic about, is the fossil fuel industry itself. Now, the fossil fuel industry is massive, right? Like they are making huge profits, especially right now with prices as high as they are, and they're not going to want to give that up. It is entirely selfish of them. They know that what they're doing. We know they've known what they've been doing for like 50 years now. Like Shell was aware of climate change in the 70s. It's really like it's going to be people power against this big kind of moneyed interest. That's where I put my hope anyway. And I think that's what we need to do, is like get together and change people's minds, change people's attitudes. And I found the recent election, the federal election, so encouraging.
Yeah, I was going to mention that it was a good sign that people are starting to pay attention. They do want to see a change in this area.
It's honestly the most optimistic I've been about like the future and Australian politics in my lifetime, basically. I think it's really exciting. Yeah.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is we're going to bring this video section to an end. We're going to head over to the Games with Wings Discord server very shortly. If anyone wants to join us, I'm putting the link to that in the chat right now. Nico says, thanks for the perspective. All good points. And before we do head off, Ben, can I ask you just to share your website address again for anyone who wants to go ahead and have a look?
Yeah, so my personal website is just benabraham.net, And I also have a newsletter that I publish, which is like a weekly thing that goes out. And that's just at Greening the Games Industry, or gtg.benabraham.net. So, yeah.
Excellent. Lots of people saying thank you in the chat. We had a couple of people that had to head off early for various things. Mark Bart, who's one of the Wargaming Sydney crew, said thank you very much. Simon has just said thanks. Alex has said thanks. Nico has said thanks. Bilal has said thanks. So lots of thank yous for tonight. It was a really great talk. As I say, we are going to head over to the Games with Wings Discord server now. Ben will be there for a while. So if you do have any other questions, or there's anything you want to get Ben's perspective on, please head over there. Myself and Ben will be there just in a minute or so. We'll just shut things down here and maybe grab a bathroom break. You never know, something like that. If you enjoyed this talk, I've got to do the usual YouTuber thing. Like it if you liked it, so that we know, okay, everyone liked this talk. If you want to subscribe to the Wargaming Sydney YouTube channel, you'll get notifications for when the next talk is coming up. And also, please share this with anyone in any Discord or Facebook channels, anyone you think might be interested in hearing Ben's message, and we can help get that message out there a bit wider. Excuse me. Thank you very much, everyone. I will see you again for the next one of these talks. Ben, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you on Discord.